Welcome back, dudes and dudettes. Welcome back to The Anxious Truth. This is episode number 153. Welcome back to the show for another week. Appreciate the time and attention you guys give me. I really do. Today we are going to talk about the inner critic. Your inner critic, that little voice inside of you that criticizes everything you do and makes you judge yourself harshly and look at yourself as maybe a failure or less than or incapable. We're going to talk about the inner critic, and I'm going to be joined by my friend Josh Fletcher at AnxietyJosh on Instagram. We're going to talk about the inner critic. We're going to go into the realm of humanistic psychology today, which is a departure, but it's good stuff. So I think you guys are going to appreciate this. Before we get into that, and I bring Josh on, I got to tell you about, you know what I got to tell you about? I'm going to tell you about my book. It's called The Anxious Truth, just like the podcast. A step-by-step guide to understanding and overcoming panic, anxiety, and agoraphobia. It is written as a course in how to overcome an anxiety disorder, and a very logical step-by-step sequence that takes you from lost, confused, afraid, and disheartened through being educated, empowered, having a plan, knowing exactly what to do step by step, and hopefully reaching recovery. By all accounts, I have achieved the goal that I set out to achieve, which is to write a useful recovery tool based on the feedback and the reviews that I get. So check it out on my website at theanxioustruth.com/recovery guide. And if you already have the book and you're using it and you're digging it, take a minute, head on over to Amazon and write me a review. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so let's get on to this. Today we're going to talk about the inner critic, what it all means, how we can deal with it. And I'm going to bring Josh Fletcher on in a second, and I will see you guys afterwards. All right, we're back. Josh Fletcher, what up, dude?
Hi, Drew. How are you doing?
Okay, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Yay, I'm back.
Yay. We got like rave review. This is the last time you and I did this, so hopefully we'll get rave reviews again, or people will hate us and never listen to us again. Either way.
Never know.
Right.
We're talking about inner critics. We might have some fervent outer
critics. Exactly right. So today's topic is the inner critic, and a few people have asked me to do this one. Like, well, how do I deal with the inner critic, that nagging voice that says, you're not good enough, you're not doing this right, you always fail, people don't like you, all those negative things. And we are our own worst critics sometimes, but I think the whole inner critic thing takes it to another level. I know some people, we might be kind of harsh on ourselves, but this is a different level. And I know that this is something that you really enjoy, and you're pretty well versed in the Rogerian stuff and the humanistic stuff. So I'm like, this is the guy we got to bring on, man.
Cool. Inner critics. No stranger to an inner critic myself. You've got to understand that an inner critic is like a Lego man. It's constructed of different blocks. It's not just one anthropomorphized thing on your shoulder saying, you're useless, you're this and that. It is constructed. The best way, and I educate my clients or people with me about this inner critic, particularly the one that gets in the way of exposure work and trying to do difficult things. The best way to describe it is to learn a fancy new word. You ready for this new word? It might not be new to you, but the fancy new word is introjections. Not interjection, introjection. And it's one of my favorite words in psychology. And it is Rogerian, yes. It comes from the work of Carl Rogers, who's great. I always dream and fantasize that he's my father. But then I wake up and, he's not. And an introjection. Oh, what is an introjection? An introjection is an absorbed belief system from an event. And you can have a direct introjection or an indirect one. So, I don't know, if I'm growing up and I'm flamboyant and gay and my father turns around to me and says, don't be gay, be strong, I might directly introject that, well, it's not okay to be flamboyant and gay. So I've introjected a belief system there, my father's.
Yeah.
Obviously, my father's belief system sucks, but as a kid, who am I to know? I'm genetically wired to adore him. That's an example of a direct one. Maybe your mum says, every time you cross the road, look left and right. It's important to be safe when you cross the road. And so you introject a positive thing there. Even in religion, whether you're religious or not, there's positives from religion, you introject a less, don't murder, and things like that. Don't commit adultery, things like that, all these kind of things. Do not steal. And we introject beliefs, and that's more of a direct one. But we also introject indirect ones, and they're the ones that form the building blocks of this inner critic. And they're usually negative ones, or just kind of, I'll give some examples because it's really cool. I love talking about this.
Yeah.
So for example, I'm a kid, I come home from school, I've got all A's, and mom and dad praise me, put my work on the fridge. I'm the best thing since sliced bread. Well done, me. What might I introject from that experience, Drew?
Well, that you're the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Excellent.
You're good.
Brilliant.
Yeah, you're a good person. Yeah.
I'm a good person. I'm clever. I'm capable. That's
right.
brilliant.
Right.
Yeah. Let's say the next week I do a test and I get a B, I don't get A, and parents aren't happy. Then what happens? What might I introject?
Well, you might interject that you're not as good as you thought you were. There's a problem here. Could be a problem.
Could be a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what you got, and you'll notice this, is that lots of people who develop anxiety disorders have perfectionism as a crutch. And so that's a small example of how we can introject a lesson, a belief system that in order for me to have value, I have to achieve 100%. And that's a really strong one that people have. And also, if I can't do it right, why would I bother at all? Let's say, I'm a sibling and I'm doing all right, nothing special. And then my sibling comes home and gets praised because they got an award and for doing something menial or whatever.
Yeah.
What we might interject from that is, oh, I must be like them. And that's an indirect one. But you get some really, really strong ones. So one that gets in the way of recovery is emotional conservatism, particularly in the UK. I don't know what it's like in the US, but like, don't show your emotions, things like that. And that is a result of introjected beliefs. If I'm sat at a funeral crying because grandma's died, I'm never going to see her again. It's a really mind-blowing concept and it's triggering all sorts of anxiety, existential anxiety, grief, a really horrible thing to go through.
Yeah.
And my uncle leans over and says, don't cry, be strong for your grandma. What's that teaching me? What am I introjecting from that?
Yeah. That's showing emotions is not a good thing. You're not allowed to do that. Shouldn't do that.
Being vulnerable is not a good thing.
Right. Feeling them in general.
Feeling them. Yeah. There's something wrong with me for doing that.
Right.
So you take people that have had these trickled introjections all their life, and they get to adulthood and they base their life on conditions of worth. And these conditions of worth are like a little checklist that you've got. If I do this, I've got value. If I do this, I've got worth. If I do this, I've got value.
Yeah.
And some of them, the more you have, the harder life is. And some of them are just utter nonsense. So, there's no coincidence that the biggest killer of men's depression, when you've got this whole rhetoric of, you can't show your emotions, blah, blah, blah. That's just a result of introjected beliefs. Now, apply this to anxious exposure. Apply this to agoraphobia. So if I'm struggling with panic attacks, first of all, my inner critic's like, why are you anxious in the first place? You shouldn't.
Right.
Secondly, you leave the house. Don't show people that you're vulnerable. Thirdly, avoidance will win, because why would you go to that party and show your vulnerability, show your emotions?
Yeah.
And four, if you can't do it right the first time, what's the point in doing it at all?
Right.
And that's just a small example of how introjected beliefs form an inner critic. And this inner critic could be made up of loads of introjected beliefs. Where it's I feel sorry for like the younger generation now. I really do. I do not want to be young, because their introjected beliefs that they've got from the bad side of social media and things, and image and stuff like that is going to struggle. So yeah, how do you think this relates to kind of anxiety, and do you think it does at all?
I think it definitely does. I mean, I've seen it now in people that are dealing with more of the social anxiety stuff, for sure. And what I find insidious is the subtlety of this inner critic that is continually scanning for signs of approval and approval and approval. And I think the reality of that is, in our day-to-day, I mean, you and I have a conversation, I'm not really showing, I mean, I guess I am to a certain extent, we could probably argue that, but I'm not really heaping praise or approval upon you, nor are you doing that to me. So somebody who is really.
Drew. That's why I came on.
Oh, well, we'll save it for the end. Poor Josh, ruined his day. But I think, and when we don't see that, because it's not overt, we're not constantly being praised or acknowledged as doing a good job with a gold star in whatever we're doing, whether it's a conversation or as a good listener or a good person. With that lack of approval seems to trigger that, like, see, you know, you're so bad at this. You're so awkward. You're so this. You don't know how to carry on a conversation. You ruined the whole thing. Like, everybody was doing great and you can't. So those are the inner critics that I hear a lot, very social related. But I also hear it in the recovery process. You know, the minute that there is the sign of panic or the minute there is anxiety and exposure, that's fail. If I feel particularly vulnerable or weak that day because I'm struggling, that's a fail. If I feel anything, that's a fail. Like,
yeah.
If
you're a perfectionist, you will struggle with anxious recovery.
Yes.
I was a perfectionist before I was diagnosed with panic disorder and agoraphobia.
Yeah.
And actually, panic disorder and agoraphobia taught me that it's okay not to be perfect, and actually taught me a valuable life lesson. I just wanted to talk to you about the kind of, particularly social anxiety and inner critic as well.
Yeah.
As we know, anxiety at its very core is the body's threat response. Now, our friend Kimberly Quinlan talks about the kind of ancestry, the kind of primitive response for that. Like, you know, we don't want to be rejected because we couldn't survive in a pack or in a tribe thousands of years ago.
Right.
But also just even value, and this is really, really important, the threat response also triggers in response to any threat to our self-esteem. Because when we don't have self-esteem, that is dangerous for us. That's why people get depressed and kill themselves, because they don't have any. They don't feel like they have any worth.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you think about it from an esteem point of view, the threat response will kick off when there is a threat to self-esteem. And this is why people with social anxiety have that extra layer.
Yeah.
This is why I unpick people. Why do people's judgment matter to you? What does that mean to you? And then that's when you pick apart those introjected beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, it could
because
be even from like,
the lack of positive affirmation coming from the outside in triggers that threat response. I did not get the shot that I need to raise my self-esteem. So therefore I'm in a crisis mode now. Yeah.
Or criteria specific praise. So I often hear therapist thing where I rub my hands together like, oh, here we go. This is gonna be mum and dad. When every time I hear someone say, but I had a wonderful childhood, my brain goes, let's have a look at this. They're all full of praise for me and stuff. And then you find out that actually, they praised you when you met their expectations.
Right. Yeah.
But actually you found out that when you were sad, or if you've got a narcissistic parent who finds your upset as an insult to their ego,
right?
You know, like it's somehow accusatory of them.
Yeah.
You start to introject really salty, nasty lessons about what it is to be successful. So you could be super successful, have a really good childhood, be financially supported, blah 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 blah. But what have you introjected from that? You've introjected that you only did this because it's only okay to succeed. Right. If you've never learned to fail, then that's a lesson that you'll need to learn to overcome anxiety disorders. If failure has never been modeled to you, then that's important. You need to learn that it's okay to fail.
Or even acknowledged. Because I think a lot of times, and people will say that, like, you know, I've had this perfect childhood. My parents are awesome. There was no problem. And that's probably true, you know, from a macro standpoint. But even the best parents, you know, if you praise your child when you do something good, that's great, right? But if you do not acknowledge their failures or their mistakes, and I don't mean to punish them, I mean to at least acknowledge them. Like, hey, that was a rough day, I see. It's okay. You know, we all fail sometimes. You can pick yourself up tomorrow. What can we learn from it? That sort of thing. If you at least acknowledge that human beings sometimes fail, sometimes have negative experiences or undesirable experiences. If you forget that part of parenting, I can imagine that you can produce a human being that ultimately knows it's only okay if I am succeeding and being praised. Anything neutral or negative is a disaster.
And therefore you have a binary view of success.
Yes.
And I always used to say, here's a binary view of success. If you're approaching anxiety disorders and exposure with a binary view of success, you're gonna, okay, you might nail it. It's a flip of a coin. You might nail it on the first attempt, but then you practice again the next week and it doesn't go as well. that binary view of success will say, oh no, you failed, what's the point?
Yeah.
But that is, again, it's a building block. The inner critic is a Lego man of different building blocks. Here's another example. So I'll ask you, Drew, that we'll play the Introjection game, the worst quiz show in the history of mankind. You know, if actually I grew up with really caring parents, but and statistically, if you've got an anxiety disorder, your mum and dad will be an anxious wreck too. Now, what might I interject when my mum's never in the room to show me she's anxious? You know, I hear this all the time. I need to protect my children from my anxiety. What? No, go and be anxious in front of your kids and show them that it's normal and it's all right.
Yeah.
You know, and then they won't freak out and have secondary fear when they're anxious. So they're watching you. And I hear this, and if there's parents listening to this, don't hide your anxiety, because what your children will indirectly introject is that it's something to be ashamed of.
Yeah.
And that's something that kind of passes down, and you learn from that, adds to the taboo. So yeah, what do you introject if you suddenly see your parent taking deep breaths and they have to walk out the room? What do you introject as a child?
Oh, I would adopt a belief that is not an acceptable state. Like this is a state that needs to be hidden. It's shameful. It's not right. And it might even be dangerous. If you can't stay in the room with me while you feel that way, what's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is not acceptable.
And challenging them even societally, but like, you can own them. I went to the football. I did this typically masculine thing just over a year ago. Went to the football, loads of rowdy lads, all with beers and chanting and also, I love it. It's great escapism.
Yeah.
And in the middle of it, I was like, I'm just going to take a moment out. I'm a bit overwhelmed. I could stand here and tolerate this, but I'm just going to take a bit of a breath, because there's lots of shouting and there's lots of beer inside of being thrown over. I'm just going to take a moment here because I'm anxious. And they were like, sure, is there anything we can do? I was like, no, there's nothing wrong with me. I just need to take a moment. And that was cool. And my friend's completely fine with that. People don't care if you own it.
Yeah.
You know, just like whatever.
But you know,
no one spoke about it.
That's funny because in that situation, you're not looking for you're being courteous to say like, hey, I'm just going to step out for a second. But you're not looking for their approval that it's okay or not okay.
Or reassurance.
Reassurance, right.
I know what this is. I'm just choosing.
Right.
You know, I've done my exposure. This is just a really intense moment when there's thousands of people chanting and screaming, and I just feel a bit overwhelmed. And I think people will do that whether they have an anxiety disorder or not.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that there was no shame from me in doing it.
Right.
You know, that was it. You know, and it was joked about like, now I'm having a moment out. Now you get the beers, or any excuses. Oh, here he is. His anxiety is triggering because it's his round. You know,
that is convenient, though. I will say that is very convenient. So I think what's interesting about that is then you have people who, you know, it doesn't matter what the trigger is in a way. So in that situation, like, oh, you know, in a loud situation, I may have to excuse myself for a minute or two just to get my bearings again. Like, that's okay. I'm going to come back in. I'll be right back. Or the person who is the naturally quiet person of the group, who is consistently hearing that inner critic that like, why are you not participating? Why you're not participating? And, you know, you had to tell that person like, well, you might just be the listener. That's okay. You're valid. Even if you are not the most verbose person in the room, it's okay. Like we need all different kinds of people, but then they still wind up in that inner critic cycle of like, see, you cannot participate. You can't, you ruin everything. You just don't know how to even have a conversation. Everybody else is there and you're not. What's going on here? But it's hard for that person to accept that, like, oh no, I'm just a quieter person. I'm more likely to listen and I have maybe fewer words, and that's okay.
So, absolutely. I mean, again, the seance of Carl Rogers, look at the difference between unconditional positive regard and conditional. And a good way to identify the difference between the two is that if your friend or family member or partner is really upset, how do you react? And most people go, oh yeah, I go over, I tell them they're fine. Are you judging them? They're like, no, I just want them to get better.
Right.
Do you see them as weak? No, I don't see them as weak. I know they're strong. I want to see them as better. So you see these people with unconditional positive regard, which is such a wonderful gift. It makes you wonderfully human. I love getting all humanistic and soft and gooey. It's dead nice, you know. But then have you noticed that when you struggle in exactly the same way, that unconditional switches to conditional? And that's what an inner critic is.
Yeah.
You're not meeting those conditions that you formulated as a result of those introjections growing up.
Right.
And me as a therapist, I help to identify those. And I also ask, whose voice is that? Is that your voice? Because when your friend's struggling, You don't use that voice.
Right.
So whose voice is that? Is it Uncle Tony's at the funeral telling you to be strong because grandma's dead? Well, Uncle Tony's a moron, and you should have known that already.
Right.
Look at the state of him. He can't even tidy his kitchen. He's had old tea bags on the side. Sorry, I'm going to get carried away with Uncle Tony.
Is Uncle Tony listening? If he's listening, you let it out. That's fine.
He doesn't have the intelligence to listen to a podcast.
He clearly doesn't know what a podcast is, Uncle Tony.
He's a man. He's a man, Drew. Men don't listen to podcasts. I sit at home, I spit into a bucket, and I don't show my feelings. Oh, God.
That's a very British, yeah. And, I hear that all the time from you guys over there, that is a culturally ingrained thing. We do not show our feelings.
No, it was arguably necessary in the war and stuff to get us through that cultural mindset.
Yeah.
But we're not in a war anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a while ago.
Why are we still doing this? I get it.
Yeah.
I get it was needed back then. Absolutely. Anything, you take any gain in a world war.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's that mindset's becoming redundant now. Emotional conservatism needs to die, and we need to kind of be a bit more open about one of the biggest pandemics, and that's mental health, because it statistically kills more people.
Which is so, it's interesting to bring it back to what you were just talking about. Like, if you have a friend who is struggling to be, he maybe is emotionally stifled or is struggling because of that, you would probably encourage that person to like, oh, tell me what's going on. It's okay. You could talk about it. But yet you will not give yourself the same benefit of the doubt. So that's, I think, part of the whole inner critic discussion too. And I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who was asking me, and actually she triggered this. Like, let's talk about this. She was the one who triggered this conversation, this podcast episode, right? And I said, well, when you're at work and you have a client come into work and they are, just nasty, we all have those people. They're just angry. They're just nasty. Everybody's out to get them. Nobody's done anything right. And they just want to complain about the work that you're doing and how you're treating them badly. Well, what do you think about that? Well, we all just kind of do our best to placate them, and we wrinkle our noses, and then we joke about it when she leaves, and we just expect to be berated the next time she comes in the door. Okay, well, do you take that to heart? Like, do you think that she's really saying that you are a terrible person? No, of course not. But then why will you listen to, why can we not treat ourselves the way we treat that person? When the inner critic turns on, then it's real. Then it's real.
Absolutely. Understanding your own inner critic is really important too, Drew, because, and here's where I genuinely wholeheartedly give advice. Now, we blanket statement therapy as one thing, people don't get it, and you're right. But this is, if you've got an inner critic, humanistic therapy, if you go to a person-centered therapist who does not direct, who does not lead, and you say to a person-centered therapist, listen, I'm trying to overcome an anxiety disorder at the moment, and I'm happy with that side of things, but I've realized that one of the biggest stumbling blocks to exposure is this inner critic. I'd like to talk through where this voice comes from, please, and I'd like to explore these introjected beliefs. And then therefore I can go back to practicing exposure and practicing with my disordered anxiety, my fear of fear. For me, that is a dream. I absolutely love that. That's how I work in my practice with my clients. It's like, what do we do first here? Well, obviously you go for the disordered anxiety stuff, right. The fear of fear. We talk about root causes all the time, but actually here's where a root cause does exist.
Right.
Where does this inner critic come from? And it's an accumulation of things. Maybe your mum was a knob, your dad was a selfish bastard. And then you'll realize what you've introjected from that. And once you know, you can stop criticizing yourself. Go, oh yeah, it's not my fault. I am not this person. It's them. They've not got life worked out. And then you go back to the exposure, back on it, bit at a time, but by being your friend.
Yeah. That makes good sense. That makes really good sense. And it's funny to see the number of people who don't know where this, how do you not know? And in a way, I guess when you're on the outside looking in, how would you not know where it came from? But we don't, you don't. No. It's a voice inside you, and it's sometimes hard to find where those voices actually came from.
An accumulation as well. Think about it. If I'm bullied at school, ignored at home, not very good at my studies, the accumulation of all these different voices and experiences that form the internal voice. When you work with people with severe depression, that's usually where it comes from. They come to these conclusions about themselves from misinterpreting events or even just bad things happening to them. Yeah. But you unpick them because you're not your experiences, you are you.
Tough one. And again, not knowing and then having to untangle it. So now let's talk about that for a second, because everybody's going to want to know naturally. How do we untangle that then?
The magic, honestly, when in humanistic therapy, once you know, the natural cogs of your brain start to shift. But if you don't know what you're working, like if you don't know the origins of your inner critic, how can you fix it?
Right.
Now, for me, if my attic's leaking, I could sit here and try and, put a bucket down, plaster over it. But if I don't know the origin of the leak, it's going to carry on.
Right.
But then when I know the origin of the leak, I can do something about it. For me, and I've had a lot of inner critics, because I was severely bullied in school and out of school. I went to a very, very rough school where kids come to my house and stuff out of hours, and grew up on a housing estate that was very poor.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of those introjections that I had to shed, and that contributed to an inner critic. Also, I had a father who was lovely but emotionally terrible.
Yeah.
So he could never really show his emotions. So I had to unpick those introjections to understand actually, oh, that's where the inner critic comes from. Once I understood that, then it was easy for me to metacognitively observe the voice for what it was. And you naturally start to challenge it. I'll give you an example of one now, and this is from my own personal life. Yeah. Growing up, I couldn't get anything emotional out of my father, but I could make him laugh because I am hilarious. And so when he'd give me nothing, but the only way to a 4, 5, 6-year-old who's genetically wired to adore my father,
yeah,
the only way to make his face light up was to make him laugh. So I interjected a lesson then. It's important to make people laugh to have value. So I was the class clown for years. I went through school, college, university, still am the clown now. I even did stand-up comedy. Yeah. Until one day when I was in therapy, in person-centered therapy, not for anxiety disorders, just exploring these introjections, it just dawned on me one day. I was about to go on stage and it was like, oh shit, I now know why I do this.
Did you still go on stage? Or were you done at that point?
I went on stage and it wasn't as scary. And here's the thing, Drew, you'll understand this. I didn't enjoy it as much because it wasn't as scary. I was like, oh, now I know why I do it.
Yeah. I guess I'm done with this now.
Yeah. And that's just an example of what you can unpick and what was driving my behaviors. And if you can relate that to anxiety disorders, you're onto a real winner.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is a good conversation. And it's funny because we do talk about the root cause stuff all the time, and it doesn't matter. But I find that the root cause stuff does come into play when you find those obstacles for recovery. So within the disordered anxiety recovery process, you can see where there are hurdles that people are tripping over again and again and again. That is a good time to look and say, well, what's going on there? What's going on there?
Yeah. Yeah. And you take that specifically to therapy.
Yes.
So if a therapist is going, oh no, let's explore the disorder, anxiety, whatever, and they're not necessarily trained in it, then leave it. Just don't bother. But this is why I like person-centered therapy. A good person-centered therapist will say, bring whatever you want and leave with whatever you want.
Right.
And I love that as a therapeutic tool. And I still do that now. I'll go and just bring something, and they're not trying to solve everything holistically. Yeah. And just say, I'm practicing the exposure at the moment, but I have this perfectionist mindset, a very binary view of success that's really getting in the way. Can I explore that with you?
Yeah. And I think I would address this to anybody who's listening. And I know I have specific people in mind that, sometimes you see them struggling and, I just can't get it. I don't understand why I can't get it. I'm like, well, and that stuff, the inner critic starts to bubble out in those conversations a little bit. Like, well, I feel like less than a man when this happens. Okay, well, we're going to have to look at that then. This is clearly a hurdle. This is a wall in the midst of your recovery path. You're going to have to work on that, knocking that wall down now.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. A hurdle on the path.
Right, on the path. It didn't start you on the path, but it's a hurdle along the path. And many times you'll bring that up and you'll get in response kind of crickets. And then 3 weeks later, it's still, I can't get it. I don't understand. I can't get it. I can't to use your words, I can't willfully tolerate this. Yes, but that's because you already told me that when you feel these things, you immediately launch into, I am less than a man. I am not providing for my family. I'm a failure. I have no worth. So it's really hard to tolerate something willfully that physically is not dangerous to you, but psychologically, emotionally, and an identity standpoint is incredibly threatening, because this is now makes me a failure as a man. So like, you're going to have to work on that stuff. And that's where this sort of stuff comes into play.
Absolutely. And that's and challenging those big questions. What makes a man?
Yeah.
You know, I'm very emotional. I'll go about, but I'd like to still think I celebrate the lovely traits of masculinity, thanks to my ripped body and abs and stuff.
Don't make me share the video, which I wasn't going to do, but so good. Oh, and these are always good conversations. We're about 30 minutes into it, so I guess we could wrap it up. I appreciate you taking the time. We'll do more of these. So
yeah, it's great fun. Yours dropped today, I think, on the Panic Pod.
Oh, no kidding.
Thanks for coming on to my podcast. It's
All
dropped.
right.
If you want to listen to Drew and I some more, go listen to
go listen to the
special episode. We do one on attention. It's great fun.
It was a good one. It was a really good conversation. I enjoyed that too. Yeah. So if you guys go to the this will be episode 153 for me. So if you go to theanxioustruth.com/153, I'll link the other episode of the Panic Pod that you and I were on together, so you can find it there too if you need to. But otherwise, Josh, how do people find you?
I am Anxiety Josh on social media, or just look for Joshua Fletcher. My practice is called thepanicroom.co.uk, and that's linked to all the rubbish that you can browse at your leisure.
I will put all of Josh's links there, including. Come on, you could talk about it.
I didn't want to plug the book.
You can plug the book. Come on.
You even said the word untangle before.
I know. I was leading you right into it. I'm like, come on.
I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it.
Please tell me he's going to pick up the book.
Untangle Your Anxiety is out now on Amazon, and it's doing well in the US and in the UK, and wherever you listen to in the world, grab yourself a copy.
I will link that there too. It is getting rave reviews. So you and Dean seem to have done a tremendous job with that. So excellent.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Thanks for coming by, dude. I appreciate it. We'll do it again.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having me on, Drew.
You're very welcome. Let me awkwardly hit the record button to end it here. All right, we are back. That was good. Always a good conversation with Josh. We just seem to hit it off, and, we're going to do more of these as we go. In fact, after we got done with the recording, we actually came up with 2 other topics that we can do together. So stay tuned. We'll do more of those together for sure. You can find Josh and I also do a Instagram Live every Friday with Dean from DLC Anxiety and our friend Kimberly Quinlan. So you guys can check us out there. I will link everything on the show notes to this page, which is at theanxioustruth.com/153, which will have all of Josh's links and my links and links to the Instagram and all that stuff. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is a good topic. I mean, the inner critic can be a thing that really is presenting hurdles along your path, obstacles along your path to recovery, and it deserves some attention. It absolutely does. This isn't root cause that caused your anxiety, but these are things that could be hindering your progress along the path to recovery. So these are things we need to talk about a little bit more, and we need to bring in some other theories like humanistic theories and self-actualization and things of that nature, which are fascinating to talk about and I love to learn about. We'll bring them into the conversation a little bit more as we go. So thanks for coming by as always. I'm going to play you out with Afterglow by my friend Ben Drake, whom you can find at Ben Drake Music if you dig the song and you want to hear more of his work. And of course, I'm going to ask you, as I always do, if you're listening to the podcast on iTunes or any platform that lets you rate and review the podcast, then leave me a 5-star rating if you dig the podcast. And then take an extra 30 seconds and write a little review. Because if you're liking it and it's helping you, reviews help other people find it. And that's really why I spend the time to do this. So thank you much for that. And thank you for coming around and spending your time with me and giving me your attention like you do. I appreciate all of you guys. And we will see you on the next episode. And I will remind you, as I always do, that this is the way.
Yeah, you're on your way. It's in the afterglow.